And our presenter for this portion is the Reverend Timothy Brown, and he is Director for Congregation Stewardship Support, ELCA. And Tim lives in Raleigh, North Carolina. He came down this morning, about a 4-hour drive to be with us. So welcome, Tim, and thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you, Ozzy, and just making sure this is on. It's good to be here in South Carolina. I have not been being distant on purpose. My sons are bioterrorists, and one of them gave me something about 2 days ago, and I wanted to make sure I was here. I'm on a steady diet of Sudafed and Alka-Seltzer, and today this was my best day in 3 days, so I'm happy to be here and very good. But if I don't shake hands, knock rocks, I do want to talk to you. We'll just have COVID protocol. And by the way, I did take 2 COVID tests to make sure it was not COVID at all, so I am free and clear there. But my name is Tim Brown. I'm a pastor in the ELCA. I live in Raleigh, North Carolina, and have served churches in Chicago, where I started my ministry. I'm a graduate of the Lutheran School of Theology at Chicago, and then at a church in Raleigh, North Carolina, Good Shepherd. I was a senior pastor of Good Shepherd for a number of years. And from there, I got recruited out of the pulpit to work for Churchwide as Director of Congregational Stewardship. Nick and Victoria work with mission support, and they work on that end. The end that I work on is with congregations and synods around curating and creating resources and relationships to fuel ministry. And Nick and Victoria kind of split up the synods to work, but I work with all 8,600 congregations in the ELCA and all 65 synods. And it's a pleasure to be here in South Carolina and doing this work. The most important thing about me, though, is I'm a husband and a dad. My wife is a professor of biology at William Peace University in Raleigh, North Carolina. By the way, that's the one reason I knew I was sick. She diagnosed me pretty early as a biologist. I woke up two mornings ago and she said, "You were sweating all night and you don't look good." I was like, "Well, good morning. It's good to see you too." My sons are Finley and Alistair. Finley is 12 years old. He's a catcher. And in fact, he has his first game of the season this coming Tuesday. It's the only time I root for the Braves. Otherwise, we are Cubs fans through and through. Both of my boys were born in Chicago. My younger son, Alistair, is 10 years old, and he's a soccer player. About 2.5 years ago, he said, "Dad, I really want to try out for the travel soccer team." And I looked at kind of the layout, and they had 40 kids vying for 11 spots, and I said, "Go for it, big guy." And he unfortunately made the team. So now we are roped into travel soccer as a family, which is a big delight, actually. And he's made really good friends. His team, unlike a lot of teams, all the boys have been together for the last 3 years, and they're going to continue to do that and move up in the next tier. And so we're really excited to be part of the Scorpions family. And they have a game tomorrow, so if you're the praying type, they're defending champions this next year, so we're hoping they're doing all right. You know, I mentioned I was recruited out of the pulpit to work for Churchwide, and that's mostly true. I did do a short stint as a major gift officer at one of the seminaries before that. And the reason that I was recruited out to do that work is because Good Shepherd, where I was the pastor, was a big church with a big budget, over $1 million budget. And I didn't know what to do with that. I had no idea how to work with $1 million. I had no idea to talk about it. I had no idea how to fundraise around that. And so I did some intentional learning, and I did some intentional courses on that. And so that's why I call myself an accidental fundraiser. Now, I don't do any direct fundraising anymore. What I do is I help you fundraise. That's my job. That's my call. You in the synods. And just, last little thing about me, I'm a big coffee drinker. If our checkbooks are moral documents, and they are, your checkbook says what you value in life. And if it's not saying what you value in life, you need to do some adjustments there. But if our checkbooks are moral documents, my checkbook says I value coffee quite a bit. And it's actually something that I wrestle with. It's one of the things that I bring home from all my travel. I'm across the United States, travel about twice a month in this work. And the one thing I'm allowed to bring home is coffee. And so if there's a good coffee shop nearby that's local, before I leave, please tell me. I'm going to grab something before I leave. But coffee is one of my big things, and it's kind of one of the indulgences in life, and there are worse indulgences, I think. And I'm curious about generosity. I'm curious about what makes us generous people. And by and large, I'm curious about that because for most of us, especially those of us, I think, in this room, this is not true about all cultures, but for most of us, generosity is a taught behavior. We have to be taught to be generous because our natural inclination is to conserve or to just share with those that we know or to just share with those that we can kind of control how it ends up. Before we get into the main part on the budget narrative spending plan, just a little poetry. I'm big into poetry, and this is one of my favorite poems by David White, an Irishman. This is not the age of information. This is not the age of information. Forget the news and the radio and the blurred screen. This is the time of loaves and fishes. People are hungry, and one good word is bread for 1,000. Thought this poem by White was appropriate for storytelling and for talking about narrative spending plans. Before we get into how you set up a narrative spending plan, though, you need to know the stories. You need to capture the stories. And not only that, I mean, Nick did a fantastic job about talking to you about how you listen to other people's stories, but you need to know your own story with generosity. So I'm going to introduce you to someone who taught me to be generous. And there I am. Oh, look, I'm so cute. I had hair. So that's me and my father. I'm checking his heartbeat right up there. And this right here was when I was in Fiddler on the Roof. And I was in plays a lot when I was a kid. And this one happened to be on Halloween. And I remember that because I couldn't go trick-or-treating that year because we had a performance. And so my parents took me around from houses dressed as a little Jewish boy for Halloween. This is my wife, Rhonda, and I when we were in college, way back when we were young and full of dreams. But the person I want to talk about right here is my grandmother. And you can see me sitting there on her lap. And that's her in her house in Miami, Florida. Her name is Lady. That's her actual name. It's a good Southern name. We're all from Florida and Alabama in my family. And Lady Bess Brown is her name. And she was the church secretary of her church for over 40 years. You can still go there in Miami Springs, Grace Lutheran in Miami Springs, Florida. And she lived in that house where that picture was taken for her whole life. Since she got married to my grandfather, at least I should say. In 1948, they bought that house with help with the GI loan for my grandfather's service in World War II. And she lived there until 3 days before she died. 3 days before she died, she moved in with my parents. And that was about enough. She said, 3 days, and that's all I'm taking. And kind of as a testament to who this person was, my grandmother had gotten up in the morning, and she had gone to the bathroom, and she was coming back from the bathroom. My dad came to help her walk back to the couch, and she said, "Leave me alone, I can do this myself." She pushed him away, and she sat down and died. And that's just kind of how she was. Her voice sounded a lot like mine does right now. She smoked since she was 16, and I'd never known her without a cigarette in her hand. It's pretty much commonplace. She loved Manhattans, and she used to pour them double bourbon. And she said she had to pour them double bourbon because if they weren't double, she couldn't taste the bourbon. And I said, well, Grandma, that's probably because you've been smoking since you were 16. And she said, no, it's because I take Claritin. I said, okay. I'm sure that's it. Yeah, she had a voice as if B. Arthur had a cold. You know, that's just her way. I remember coming home from college with my first tattoo. And I said, Grandma, I got a tattoo at school. Do you want to see it? And she had a bourbon in one hand, Manhattan, and a cigarette in the other. And it was like 11 o'clock in the afternoon, right? And she's sitting at her table in Miami Springs, and she's sitting there. I said, do you want to see my tattoo? And she goes, I don't know why anyone would do that to their body, right? She's just this really, really interesting wild woman. As a church secretary, she never knew gossip that wasn't worth sharing, right? But my grandmother lived in this house until 2009. And when Grandma Lady died, we went back down to Florida to help clean out the house and move things out. And when we came into the house on Falcon Avenue, I remember walking in and going to her bedroom. And my grandfather had died about 10 years earlier. So it was her house by this point. And there was her secretary's desk right there in the bedroom. And that desk now sits in my parents' guest bedroom. And on that secretary's desk, I found her checkbook. And as I opened up the checkbook, I found pre-written checks to all of her favorite charities. And she knew she was going to die. Pre-written checks to all of her favorite charities. Months, years in advance, all written. In there, I didn't find one bill. In there, I didn't find one obligation. In there, I only found generosity and love. Checks to the Smile Train. Her godson had a cleft palate, and so the Smile Train had really helped her out. Checks to her church that she had pre-written months in advance, filling out her pledge that she had made. Checks to her grandsons. My younger brother was still in college, right? And in that moment, she taught me that generosity, especially for disciples, is not something that comes out of our expendable income. Generosity, beloved, is planned. We plan our generosity. As disciples of Christ, we plan our generosity. And she taught me how to be generous in that moment, how to plan my generosity. If we're going to talk about a narrative spending plan or a narrative budget, we need to talk first about why we are generous and who taught us to be generous and how we are generous. And so I want to invite you just really quickly with somebody nearby. Who taught you to be generous? For me, it was my grandmother. Now, she's just one. Everybody in that picture taught me to be generous in some ways, right? See, that's the thing. There are many people who taught us to be generous. But who taught you to be generous? Just share really quickly. Who taught you to be generous? All right, folks. We'll come back real quick. So the people who taught us to be generous, they made an impact upon us, right? And we learn generosity through conscious and subconscious ways. And thinking intentionally about generosity can bring us to a point of awareness where we can start sharing the stories of people who made an impact on us. And I just want you to imagine, what if you started your annual congregation meeting asking this question and just inviting people to share, who taught you to be generous? How would that change the discussion around the spending plan? How would it change the discussion around volunteering? Who taught you to be generous with your time? See, that's the other thing. So I deal with congregational stewardship, but it's not just around finances. Actually, there are 10 areas of stewardship that I kind of cover. One of them is time, calendars. For most of us, our calendars manage us instead of us managing our calendars. But some people have taught us to be generous with our time. Who taught you to be generous with your time? Or your space? You know, growing up, we always had somebody living with us. Somebody who was not our family, but they became our family. And I asked my dad one time, you know, why did we always have somebody living with us? He said, well, we had a spare room. Why else would we have a spare room? I mean, one time it was Tracy, one of my mom's classmates from college. One time it was Betty. She was a congregation member having some family trouble. Jason and Jackie lived with us for about 6 months. And then when I grew up and a fraternity brother called me and he was on some hard times, guess who lived in our basement? And he lived there for a year. And we had just had a baby. And I said to him, look, if you can survive this, you can do anything. And then later on, we had another one live with us just about a year ago. And I said, we got 2 boys, but we got an extra bedroom, so, I mean, you can have it for a while if you need it. And he did, and about 2 months, and that was when he decided not to have children. But you see, I was taught how to do that. I was taught, subconsciously or consciously. It made an impact on me. The question that keeps me up at night, one that I think about quite a bit, is who's going to say that I taught them to be generous? If we can talk about the people who impacted us and taught us how to be generous, and then we can think about how we can impact others and our generosity, we are getting at the heart of what it means to be a disciple who thinks about life through a stewardship lens. Everything we do is stewardship. It's everything we do after we say the phrase, I believe. It's all about stewardship, and it all intertwines. If you're talking about a narrative spending plan or a narrative budget, and by the way, you don't have a budget, you have a spending plan. I can talk about that in just a second if you want. You're talking about things that impact others, impact stories. So in generosity, we talked about who taught us to be generous. They made an impact on us. Now think congregationally. How does your congregation and the ministry that you do make an impact? Not just on folks outside your walls, but also in the lives of the folks inside your walls. So, short story time. This is a coffee shop. Told you I like coffee. In Chicago. It was around the corner from my first parish. My first parish in Chicago was an inner city up in Lincoln Square. If you've ever been to Chicago, it's a great neighborhood. The Grind was the local coffee shop that was around the corner. My parishioners knew that if I wasn't in the office, I was at the Grind. That's where I was. And I would often write my sermons there. And it was a small place. Functionally, with the seating and everything, it was about twice the size of the stage. That's about it. And so you had these chairs or these tables, and on these tables there were little signs that said, if you didn't come with somebody, expect that somebody you don't know is going to sit across from you. And you just knew this. I ended up doing funerals for people that never darkened the door of my church because I met them at that coffee shop. The owner, Tara, she and I were about the same age. And Tara, when she heard of somebody who was a regular at the coffee shop died, she would call me up. Hey, can you do a funeral? Absolutely, right? Became a community. They invited me to their annual Christmas party for just the baristas. They called me Father Tim, which was really funny. You can see none of them went to church. But I go to the grind one morning, and there's a line out the door and around the corner, which never happened. And when you know the owner, you can skip the line, right? And so I skip right in, and I go to the back, and Tara and the baristas are all working really hard. And I said, what is going on? All this extra business here. And she said, oh, yeah, well, the Green Monster is closed down the street for renovations. The Green Monster is Starbucks, right? And she said, they're closed for renovations, so everybody came here. And I said, well, you're learning to make a lot of new drinks, aren't you? And she said, no. If they come in and they order what they want at Starbucks, I tell them, we don't do that here. You can have the roast of the day, and you can have our standard medium roast. I can make you a latte. I can make you a cortado. I can make you a mocha. I can make you a flat white. But if you want what you usually have at Starbucks, I'll show you how to get to the other Starbucks. It's just 2 blocks north. And she did this. And I said, you're losing a lot of money doing this. And she said, look, I know what we do, and we do it really well. And that's what we do. And if they want something else, I'll help them go find it, but it's not us. Now imagine me as a parish pastor, first call in a medium-sized parish in the inner city of Chicago with a church plant across the street and a Methodist church down the street and a huge Catholic church on the corner where a lot of my youth group went to school, and church plants going all over the place, and me thinking in my head, I have to compete with all these other places. She taught me in that moment, no, focus on what you do it really well, become unapologetic about it, and you're going to get the people in the door that want to be there. And if folks want something else, help them find it. And don't apologize for it. Know what you do well. See, wrapped up in your spending plan should be elements that tell the story of what you do well. The things that you do well. It should highlight the things that you know and you do well. And you don't have to apologize for it. I was working with a congregation in Lexington, North Carolina, another Lexington. It's a little small place. And I was working with them, and I knew the pastor, and she invited me to come preach. And then she said, and can you do a Sunday school for them at the beginning? I said, absolutely. So we're in Sunday school, and I'm chatting with them. And they were talking about the church and how, the area had changed and the young families had moved away, or they'd gone to the big box church down the street. And I said, well, how did you all end up here? And one of them had grown up there, and another one had said that, well, she kind of grew out of the big box church because her kids moved away. And so she was looking for something, and so she came over to Holly Grove. And another one said, well, yeah, that's how I ended up here too. And as we were talking, and I said, well, what does Holly Grove need, this church in Lexington? And they said, well, we need young families. And I said, well, time out. All of you just said that you ended up here because you felt displaced from other places that were looking for young families. Is it not a mission to serve people in their 50s and 60s and 70s? Is that not something that God calls our churches to do? I mean, I haven't been 60 yet, but if history proves true, I probably will be one day. And I think I'm going to need Jesus just as much then as I do now. And they said, you mean a mission could be reaching people in their 50s and 60s? I said, yes. Not only can that be a mission, I think there are some places that need that as their mission, and there are people who want that as their mission. It doesn't mean that you don't have young families, but it doesn't mean that you're always looking for what's not there. You're attending to what is there. It's like every time you go to a party and somebody says so-and-so isn't here, and you're like, yeah, but I am. But I am. Do I not matter? Do I not count? And so they adopted this as one of their missions. And guess what? When they started adopting that as their mission, guess where they started to grow? In young families. Why? Well, because there were young families out there who wanted their kids to have grandparents. And they found it there. Reach into the unique thing that your congregation does. Highlight that. Tell that impact story. So I'm thinking about this with you right now. What unique thing does your church do to change lives? I want you to actually write it down. What unique thing does your church do to change lives? This is a question you should be asking your council yearly. You should be asking your council, what would be missing in our town, our city, or our neighborhood if your church was gone tomorrow? Not what would the people in the pews miss. What would the people outside the pews miss? Because that's what people are seeing that your church brings to the community. And kind of highlighting on what Nick was talking about. What stories of life change through Christ are alive in your church? Your mission spending plan should highlight these things. And how are those in your community uniquely generous? And how can you tell those stories? You don't have to have the biggest youth group. You don't have to have the biggest food pantry. You don't have to have the most people in worship. You just have to know what you do it really well, and be unapologetic about it. Because that's what God is calling out of you. Now, I know you may not believe it, but I've actually been talking about your narrative spending plan this whole time. And we're going to get into the real nuts and bolts of that in a second. But before we do that, questions, comments, ideas, thoughts that are in the room. I'm going to rephrase that, and I'm going to use some of Nick's strategy with this. By the way, my relationship with my boys changed when I stopped asking them, how was school today? And started saying, what made you laugh today? And instead of saying, how do you feel? I asked them, how does your heart feel? It changes everything. So I'm going to say this. What's an aha? Something you didn't think about before that you heard here? Or what's a, I don't know if that's true or not, that you heard? Sir. Yeah. I didn't come up with that line, just by the way. That's Clarence Stout, and he's a professor, but yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. What's an aha or a Yes, please.
I just appreciate the reminder that.
Oh, sorry, Ozzy, I forget about the mic. Make it green. If you make the light on it green.
It is green? Okay.
There it is.
For me, I just appreciate the reminder that we don't have to compete, with the church or whoever down the block, and to focus on kind of the unique thing or where this particular faith community is making a difference. And because it's really easy to get caught up in this church down the road has this many people or this many services or, whatever it may be. So that's just, for me, a helpful reminder.
Yeah. Yeah. We got one over here, Ozzy.
I'm Andrew Hendricks from Wittenberg and Batesburg, Leesville, and I really love the storytelling in effect at St. Michael up in Greenville. And it's made me think, what are the stories of my fellow parishioners that I don't know? That I know them superficially. I like them. I love them. But I don't really know them. And this is very interesting to see how we can dig deeper and better understand each other.
Wonderful.
I appreciate what you bring up about the community impact. And I think it's a great way to dissect our purpose in the community as a congregation. How do we impact, and what would be missing if we went away?
Yeah.
I love that examination.
Absolutely. Yeah, stories of impact are what we're talking about, right? When we were talking about generosity, who taught us to be generous, that was how somebody impacted us. And this, we moved to the congregation. We kind of widened that lens a little bit. What impact does the ministry have for folks outside the church and inside the church? How does that move? When you are compiling all these things, when you can get used to saying your generosity story, hearing, as Nick was saying, good generosity stories out there, or good stories of people being good stewards of their life, then you have all the tools that you need to create a narrative spending plan. Now, I said before that you don't have a budget, and I mean that. When I work with congregations, I say all the time, I'm sorry, you don't have a budget. One of the reasons I say that is because, first of all, when you see budget, I don't know if you're like me, but the image that comes to my mind is you see a fence. Budgets are fences. Outside of this, we cannot go. Unfortunately, that's not what you have. You have fuel, not fences. You have a feed box, not a fence. This is why I talk about a spending plan, because it's a plan for how you're going to use the resources, for how you're going to steward the resources. One of the reasons that I think that churches have gotten into some trouble is because they've looked at their narrative spending plan like a home budget. What is your home budget's purpose? So you don't overspend, to keep you around until you die, right? That's not the purpose of a church's spending plan. A church's spending plan is to fulfill the mission that God has put inside of them. That's the church's spending plan. That's what you have there. And so I encourage congregations and synods to look at everything, from their line items to their endowments to everything they have, through the question of mission. How is this helping us fulfill the mission that God has called us to? Which somebody one time says, well, how do we know the mission God has called us to? And I said, if you don't know what God is calling you to do, you got a bigger problem than the mission spending plan. You got to start thinking carefully about that. When you're starting to talk about a mission spending plan, this is the first step, and I think this is the most important step. A lot of our folks, by the way, does anybody do a narrative budget or a narrative spending plan? Some folks do. There we go. Thank you. Some folks do. One of the things that we can get into the habit of doing, though, with if we do a narrative spending plan, is just reusing things year to year, which can be dangerous. It's kind of like when you start electronically giving. If you don't go and revisit every year and update that, you're not really stewarding it well. You're doing what that old commercial said, set it and forget it, right? We're not called to set it and forget it when it comes to our lives and stewardship. What you want to do, though, is you need to talk to your congregation, you need to talk to your council, you need to talk to your staff about how a narrative spending plan tells the qualitative story, not just the quantitative story. It tells the impact story, not just how much it's going to cost. It tells the impact, not the cost. Narrative spending plans, they don't hide costs, because here's the thing. When folks do narrative budgets or narrative spending plans, they're all like, so we're not going to give them the line item budget? Well, of course you are. You're going to put that on the back. It's like when my son comes home and his math teacher says, show me your work. That's the work. That's where we get it from, right? But it doesn't tell anything. Those numbers on a budget don't say anything. And if they don't say anything, they don't move your heart. Stories move your heart. Narrative spending plans don't hide costs, they reveal the mission priorities, and narrative spending plans are necessarily future-oriented. If you're going to raise your spending plan, I'm going to use the word budget here just because it's our normal vernacular. If you're going to raise your budget over the next year and you don't explain the mission that's going to be unleashed in the difference there, then you're missing the opportunity to talk about what your church is doing and why. And guess what? You can't just be raising the budget just because costs are going up. Costs are going up everywhere. Tell the truth about why you're doing that. Well, we're actually raising the budget because we care about our pastor and we want her to have health care. And health care costs are going up and we care about her. She needs to be healthy, and that's why we're raising it. Right? So first, be clear on what a narrative spending plan is and is not. It is about qualitative stories, not just the quantitative story. It's about telling the truth, not just telling facts. By the way, if you want to know the difference between those two, Let's do a little thought experiment really quickly, if you'll do it with me. There's a difference between just truth and facts. I want you to close your eyes, and I want you to see a building in your mind's eye, all right? See this building? You can see it, everybody? All right. That's where I live. This building that you're imagining, that's where I live. Now I want you to imagine it at the end of a cul-de-sac. See at the end of a cul-de-sac? How did the building change when you put it at the end of a cul-de-sac? See? All right. Keep it there. It's at the end of a cul-de-sac. So this is where I live at the end of a cul-de-sac. Now it's going to shift. Say, actually, that's not just where I live, and it's not just at the end of a cul-de-sac. That's where I'm raising my babies. How did it change? You see a bike in the front? You see a basketball hoop? See, open your eyes. All three of those things I said were facts, but only one was true. That last one was true. We need to start telling the truth about what we do. Narrative spending plans tell the truth about what we do. They don't just tell facts. It's kind of what Nick was talking about with the boiler. This is why I tell congregations all the time, you don't actually have an electric bill. You have the ability to keep your lights on after dark so that people can tell deep truths in the basement at AA meetings because this world is not safe for them to tell them other places. You actually don't have a heating bill. You have the ability to keep kids able to pay attention to a story about Jesus because they're not distracted because they're too cold. That's the truth. We focus so much on the facts that we never get to the truth. And the truth is where our hearts live, beloved. So step one, become clear on what you're doing. You're going to tell the truth. Step two, this is how you organize a narrative spending plan. I'm going to give you an example in a minute. But you decide your areas of impact. And the best way to do this, I've found, is to use your mission statement. You know, it's kind of the answer to what do you do that somebody asked you at a cocktail party, right? Your mission statement should be what you do. And if it's not what you do, it's time to revisit that, right? So you decide your areas of impact. Usually it's 3 or 4. If you get more than 5, you have way too many areas of impact, right? But what you're going to do is you're going to split up the work of your church into areas of impact. So worship, learning, and service, is that it? Or is it caring, outreach, praise, and education? Is it grace, peace, hope, and love, if you want to go biblical model? Is it faith formation, service to the world, and love of God? You decide your areas of impact because what you're doing is you're going to take that budget, that mission spending plan, and you're going to break it up into these 4 areas. Because if that budget can't say how you're actually achieving your mission, then what are you doing? Questions so far? I'm going to give you some examples. All right. And then you have your line item spending plan ready. If you want to call it a budget still, you can. I won't. Be ready to split it up with the areas of impact in mind. Because what you can do then is get a highlighter out, and the highlighter becomes your friend. And let's say you have 4 areas of impact, right? Well, each area of impact gets a color. And then you start highlighting areas that fit under those areas of impact. Like this. This is just St. Jude by the Butterfly Preserve. A lovely little church. You can see here, red highlighter for partner ministries, blue for faith, purple for worship, light green for care, dark green with ministry support. This is just an example. And what they did is they took this and they started highlighting. And you can see exactly how they did it. Right? You're getting it. You're understanding. Because what you're doing is you're cutting up that narrative, you're cutting up that budget, not into line items, but into impact areas. You're going to do this with your staff too. Your staff should do an audit. Right? And just what were you doing? My mother said to me all the time at high school, right? Staffs do an audit. How much time do they spend in each of those impact areas? And they can be general. It's okay to generalize it. They split it up. Rough estimations are okay, because remember, the line item budget is at the back that tells the exact details, asking them how they do it. And by the way, this is a good area or a good time for your staff to imagine if they are stewarding their time well. Because if they're the faith formation staff person, but they're spending a lot more time on visitation, well, that's not good stewardship. Either change their title or change their calendar, right? Here's an example. Pastor Sally, Pastor Joe, they have a parish life director. This is a big church, obviously. Admin assistant, custodian, and then the building use, by the way. You should do this with your building also. Figure out how much of your building is used at what time and by whom. But for this one, and that's a good question of, are you stewarding your space well? I do a lot with that. Don't pay attention to the percentages on that one as much as anything else. Pay attention to how Pastor Sally and Pastor Joe split up their time. This is how they're doing it. And by the way, if those numbers are over 100 at the end, which sometimes it is, that's also a stewardship problem. You're creating a narrative spending plan. You're going to talk about impact. And right now, you're figuring out what areas of the budget impact what parts of your ministry that your congregation is calling out. And then you total up your impact costs, literally, and use your congregation members to help. And what I mean by that is, you don't like numbers? Listen, I was told I was bad at math, and here I am, and all I do is work with numbers, right? I was told in third grade that I was bad at math. I believed that lie until I was a freshman in college, when I took a logic and critical thinking class, and I excelled at logic. I was taught the wrong method, right, on how to do things. But if you're bad at math, you don't like spreadsheets, there's someone in your congregation that loves them. I hired somebody to work on my team, and she loves Excel, and thank God for her. She is amazing. She does amazing things with Excel. Somebody loves them. Use them. Utilize your congregation. Here's an example. This is a really concise narrative budget. And that's the other thing. A lot of churches think that you have to start out big or strong. I'm Scotch-Irish. There's an Irish phrase that I keep on my computer at home. It says, every beginning is weak. That's okay. This is a really simple narrative spending plan. You can see this is the line item budget, and what they've done is they've turned it into a narrative budget. They've done the color coding, they've totaled everything up, and then they talk about it. So worship and ministry is about 33% of their budget, $67,000 roughly. And then they talk about what it does. Their learning ministry, these are their 4 areas of impact. It's about 25%. Caring is 16%. Reaching out ministry is about 24%. Now, the cool thing about this is not only does it give the narrative, what they do, but it also asks the question, is this how God is calling us to allocate our ministries? You get to ask that question. And if it's not, you get to reformulate it for next year, right? This is a simple one. What I'd rather you see in those narrative, in that narrative side, is under worship ministry, a couple of quotes from people who participate in the choir and find it life-giving, or a couple of quotes from folks who are really moved by the transcendental nature of your worship, or a story about somebody who had their life changed in worship or because of worship, right? Same thing for the learning ministry. I told my Sunday school director one year, I was like, look, that report you do at the end of the year, I don't want you to do that anymore. I just want you to get quotes from 7 kids who learned something new about Jesus this last year. And that can be your report. And she said, that's the report? I said, that's the report. And she said, well, why have we been counting? And I was like, yeah, I know. You've been talking about the quantitative for so long that we forget about the qualitative. And by the way, those quotes that kids learned about Jesus, we stopped taking the numbers out of the bulletin that talked about giving from this week to last week and what is needed. We took those out and we started putting those quotes in. Because we stopped talking about what wasn't there and started talking about what was there. And nobody missed it. Here's another example of a budget that was split up into kind of the mission impact areas. You can see here. The reason I included this one is the totals from off budget. If you raise money for certain things like mission support or for Lutheran World Relief or something like that, and you want to include it in the budget, but it's not part of operating costs, that's one of the places that you can put it. But this is the line item from a narrative budget that's already split up that way. And with this would be slides and slides of stories about programs in worship, folks who have their lives changed and are changing lives because they're doing it, folks who were impacted by outreach. How many times have you talked about the work that the church does outside of your walls in the South Carolina Synod? In worship. I mean, one of the cool things that could do, if you guys still pass the plate, and I do encourage folks to pass the plate or have some sort of movement in the offering time instead of just putting it at the back like we all started to do during the pandemic. And if you want that, I have a whole nother webinar about how you can make the offering a highlight of worship. But one of the cool things that you can do is, as the ushers are coming forward with the plates or whatnot, have somebody up there in just 20 seconds say, hey, I just want you to know that this last week, I was with the bishop's office in the South Carolina Synod, and we were talking about the kids that we're going to send to the youth gathering this next year, and because of what you're doing right now, we're going to be able to sponsor 8 teens. Thank you. Now that took 20 seconds, but it made a direct connection between what they were doing with the plate and the lives that they were changing. And then you're going to talk to one of those teens that's going to the mission gathering or the yearly gathering, and you're going to get their story for the yearly mission spending plan. And you're going to include it in there as part of the youth line item budget and the mission support budget. The other cool thing that you have the opportunity to do is you can tell the whole story. You can use charts with a mission spending plan. You can use real quotes to talk about real impact. This is what truly matters in your work. We get so focused on the facts, we never tell the truth. And you can use Canva or Word or whatever medium works for your context. And you can have it made available. And you're like, well, I'm not very good at graphic design. Beloved, someone in your congregation is. Or someone in your congregation has a niece who is. Utilize them. This is what that last one looked like when it's cut up into a pie chart. Right? It gives a different visual. And see, here's the cool thing. For those of us who are left brain and really love the facts and figures, they have those available. And for those of us that are artistic and right brain, this speaks to us. You speak to the whole congregation this way. Here's another way. This was one of the synods. Right? It tells the story. And I tell you what, it tells the story so much better than your line item budget does. Now let's imagine that you're going to create a narrative spending plan. What do you do to prep your congregation to receive the narrative spending plan? Well, I think that one of the best ways to do it is to use whatever tools that your congregation uses to communicate, and you start early. This is an example from a church in Colorado. This was their monthly newsletter, and this was just one page in their monthly newsletter they started. And this was just highlighting one of their areas of ministry. This was just worship. And you can read it up there. Did you know $154,000 of our $536,000 budget supports Calvary's ministry of worship? Worship is the heart and center of our community. It is by thanking God in public, worship in private prayer, and devotion that we grab hold of salvation God offers in Jesus and makes it known. And it goes through numbers, but it shows the real impact all the way through. And this is just prepping them. And this isn't the narrative spending plan. This is just prepping the congregation for the narrative spending plan. But it's telling the story early, and it's telling it often. Here's another example. This one was one that I did in my first year at my first church in Chicago. This was our missional budget in 2014. Our mission statement was growing a Christ-centered community through life-changing service by, and this we chose, embracing all God's children as it. And we talked about how that would be. Now, into that total budget cost at the bottom was part of my salary, part of my youth director's salary, part of the admin's salary, all of those sorts of things, because we all, when we split up our time, touched embracing God's children somehow with our ministry. And it changes the focus from how much are we paying the admin to what is the admin doing? They're doing amazing things. They're supporting every ministry here. See how you change the narrative? You ask it to talk about truth, not just fact. Here's another example. This was about our community space, providing community space and a place for all the community. This was one of our goals that we wanted to do in mission in 2014. This was a rudimentary one, my first missional budget. Change it drastically by now. But that doesn't mean that it's not bad, right? And you can see at the bottom the disclaimer. Included here are portions of salary, building expenses, utilities, and administrative costs. One of the funny things in Chicago, my church was the worship spot for a Jewish community in Chicago who were kicked out of their synagogue for their political beliefs because they were anti-Zionist. And so they met here. And this changed the whole frame of reference for how the congregation saw their building. This has to be a space that we can use otherwise for other community groups. We had theater groups that would meet in our church all the time. They were doing a reboot of Starsky and Hutch for a little while, and we were the landing ground for the crew in the pit. And I remember walking downstairs one time when they were having lunch with all the crew and everything that was there, and I was in my collar, and they thought I was cast as one of the priests for the episode. Right? This is part of it, but we were talking about how we use our space. That's not a picture of the church, by the way. I'll do one more. We're serving all God's people with generosity and grace. That was one of the things that we said. And then we talked about how we were doing that. And then we put the budget cost was this, and that was the portion. And one more thought here. Just a pro tip. You actually want to show real stories of real people in your community when you do this. Get their permission first, of course, and don't ever publish anything online that you don't have permission from the person in the picture to have on there. But if you want people to make a connection between the generosity of the church and the impact it's making, show someone they know up there. It's the number one way to do it. Now imagine you're at your congregation your congregation annual meeting. Sorry, Sudafed brain. Your congregation annual meeting. And instead of starting off with just talk about the budget, you tell the story about someone who taught you how to be generous. And then you encourage people in the congregation to share with each other who taught them to be generous. And then you started talking about a narrative budget where people are generous in their worship, volunteering their time, volunteering their resources to make it beautiful. And then you talked about outreach, and you had somebody come up and tell a story about them working with the homeless shelter and how it changed their life to work there. And then you had maybe somebody from the homeless shelter come and talk about the difference that is made at the shelter because of the church and the volunteering that happens there. And then you talk about the youth outreach, and you have somebody from the youth group come up and give a testimony of how they saw Jesus in a new way this last year because of the youth group. Then you had a volunteer talk about how they were impacted because they got to volunteer with youth, and they missed that because their kids are all grown and gone. Now imagine you had all of this, and then at the end of that, you voted on the spending plan. How would that change the conversation instead of just putting up the budget and saying, this is how much it's going to increase this next year. This is how much we expect you to chip in to do that. Vote yea or nay. Mission spending plans tell the truth, not just facts. All right, I'm going to stop here really quickly and just take either questions, or you can say aha or or also I'll accept, can you go back over that? You went really quickly, which is fine. Please.
For those of us that have a lot of For those of us that have a lot of our budget, for lack of better terms, right now, caught up in staffing and property concerns and things like that. You talked a little bit about staffing, how you would divide that up. Can you talk about a little bit more about how you would divide up property into a narrative budget?
Yeah. So one of the things I hope that you're going to be doing at your congregation is doing a audit of your building. And an audit of your building means going around to each space. Like we would walk into this space, and I would invite somebody, tell me a story about this space. And somebody would share a story about the space. And then we'd say, well, how many people can we fit in this space? Not looking at the fire person's code, right? But just in general. What's this space used for? What's it good for, right? Do that with every single room, including the bathrooms. By the way, when visitors come to the church, there are two things they pay attention to the most. The first is the sermon, the second is the bathrooms. It's crazy. So if you're going to put capital into something, I always encourage you to do it in the bathrooms. Yeah. Or a pastor who preaches shorter sermons. But here's the thing. When you look at the space in that way, you can start to imagine that the space is not an albatross around the neck of the congregation, but actually your ministry wellspring. Or, I call it your ministry outpost or your ministry hub. Your ministry hub is probably a good one. This is the space that comes out. And so when you have a roofing issue, I was working with a congregation in Charlotte. And I was sitting in a room, and the pastor was talking about things going on, and then she said, we need new gutters outside. And so we got a raise for that, right? And I said, well, why do you need new gutters? And she said, well, these gutters are broken. I said, I know that. Why do you need new ones? And she said, because these don't work. I get it. Why do you need new gutters? Oh, because kids meet in this room, and we can't have mold growing in the corners. I'll give to that. You know what I won't give to them? We need new gutters. Because my house needs new gutters. I just need to clean it more. My son said that we grow better vegetables in our gutters than we do in our backyard. Which I thought was really rude. Alistair, kid's a firebrand. But you need to talk about your church hub, your ministry hub, in ways that actually connect it to the impact of the work going on there. And I think that people imagine that staffing and buildings are not mission. It's mission. Your staff is capacity. I mean, I think congregations should be proud that they pay their pastors well, instead of imagine how they can pay their pastors cheaper. I think congregations should be proud that they take good care of their musicians. We take good care of our musicians, instead of figuring out ways they can nickel and dime. Be proud about the fact that you are stewarding gifts well and helping people live well by God. And the same thing about our buildings. Now, there are some instances where pieces of our physical plant are just beyond repair. Well, then we need to talk about the actual mission. Is this space helping our mission move forward, or is it a hindrance? And we can have those conversations. Those are good conversations. It could also be a conversation of, this space lies dormant for 5 out of 7 days. Who can we invite in so it's not as dormant? Either as someone who can lease the space, rent the space, or just use the space, right? These are good conversations to have. But we should not make the mistake of thinking that our mission hubs and our staffing aren't ministry. Congregations have a ministry that happens because of their staff, and they have a ministry to their staff. Congregations have a ministry that happened because of their building, and they have a ministry to the space so that others can use it and it's safe. And one of the ways that you can do this in the narrative spending plan is by inviting people in to tell stories about the space, how they use it, why, what gives them joy about it, and then vote. Did that answer your question? Thanks, Pastor. That's a good question. And I do really want to say, in a world where we start to look at people as employee and employer, the Bible calls us back to seeing us as brothers and sisters, as people who take care of one another. You know, we can do that well. What other questions? Or do you want to go back over that? Or aha, or And I also have some more examples of mission spending plans that I'll pop up here. So you can have a whole bunch of different examples. Yes, please. Yeah, they're all available for you. Yep, you can do it back. And I think even our friend Neal is going to like overdub my voice or something when you're doing it or something like that. So that would be fantastic. I think I just signed him up for something he didn't sign up for, but we'll see. Please.
So is something like this better done at a stewardship dinner where you've got time, you don't feel, okay, we just worshiped for 45 minutes because we cut worship short, now we got to squeeze in a business meeting. Is it better to do it outside of the actual vote and meeting itself?
It just depends on the congregation. But as I said earlier, I think that before your annual meeting, there should be a big ramp up to what's going to be discussed at the annual meeting. And you can take these, whatever you decide your areas of impact are, and do a month ahead of time on each area of impact that either comes out in an email blast or in a physical newsletter if you do that. You could certainly have a generosity dinner where you're talking about this. And I think that that's a fantastic way to not only tell the story, but also that's a place to get stories, right? And you tell folks to have these conversations with one another. It just depends on the congregation. I do encourage congregations now, if you're inclined, to actually have 2 annual meetings, one for elections and then one for mission spending plan. And you have them on polar opposite sides of the year. And we did this in my congregation in Chicago. And we're like, well, we couldn't get people to come to 1 annual meeting. What about 2? Well, we got more people to come because they were shorter and they were focused and people knew what they were doing. And the cool thing was we got council members on board before we did the mission spending plan. So they got into the seat. They kind of knew how things were going by the time that the mission spending plan conversation came around. Please.
If you run into a situation where, let's say, you really need to ask for more money, do you have any advice?
Yeah, you're teeing me up. Thank you. I appreciate that. That's the next part of this. This is fantastic. Okay. Did you have more to that question before I attack it? Nope. All right, here we go. So let's imagine that you're going to ask for more money this next year because things are different. I'm going to tell you a story. Well, don't look at this really quickly. I'm going to tell you a story. I'm not in a pulpit every Sunday anymore. I'm in a pulpit a lot of Sundays, but not every Sunday anymore, which means that I can hop around to different churches, right? And so in Raleigh, I just happen to be there. My son knows that if he comes with me, he'll get a free breakfast afterwards, which is great. So Finn comes with me, and we're sitting in the church, and it's in January, and it just happened to be a Sunday where somebody from the finance team was going to come up and talk to the congregation about stewardship and the budget for the next year, right? And so this guy gets up, and you can tell he's new to the team, and he's a little bit nervous. He's about my age, and he gets up there and he starts talking about, well, prices are going up everywhere, and we just took on this building plan that's going on, and we're going to ask for an increase over last year's budget, and if you have an extra $5 in your pocket, throw it in the plate as it goes by. That was longer than that, and he was earnest and he was honest, right? But he sat back down. And after communion, Finn and I slipped out the back because we had to get to a soccer game eventually, right? But the pastor knew me, and so she saw me sitting at the back, and she called me later that day. And she said, hey, I saw you. You can't escape from my church. And I said, okay, I got you. And she said, what did you think about Kevin's talk? And I said, well, here's the thing. Like, he was earnest and he was honest, and he's a brave guy for getting up and doing that. But he told me that I should put an extra $5 in the plate. And he never told me why he was putting an extra $5 in the plate. He never told me what he was excited about for the increase for the next year. He just told me why I should do it. If you're going to ask for an increase for the coming year, you should absolutely tell the story of how that's going to change lives. Even if part of the story is we're keeping our pastor at regulation guidelines so that he can live. Even if part of the story is, hey, the insurance is going up because we have so many new ministries that are happening in this church. We are proud to pay extra because we do extra. You can make a difference. You can make this a different offering if you want it to. You can surround it with stories, and you can make it as exciting as possible. This is my church in Raleigh. We were going to ask for an increase of about $50,000 this year. And we told them exactly why. And it wasn't because prices were going up. It's because we had a youth director who was part-time, and she was overworking her hours. We were going to just bump her up, give her the time and respect that she needed to do it. We were investing in our neighbor's story. It was a smaller one, but we were investing in that. And then our future story, we were prepping and putting some away because one of our AC units was going to go. And notice I didn't say we need a new AC unit. We said our future is at stake here. Now that we're fully staffed, we long to continue to offer wages and good benefits, including small cost of living wages every year. And with our aging facilities, some of our central infrastructure is deteriorating. To ensure our mission outpost is hospitable and welcoming, we're putting away some reserves in order to replace the air conditioning units in a timely manner. And then when we were going to fundraise for those AC units, we didn't talk about the AC units. We talked about the kids who heard stories about Jesus and were too hot. Yes, sir.
This is also the perfect opportunity to use planned giving as a stewardship issue in congregations.
Absolutely.
And with the different tax ramifications that are available to larger gifts, that becomes a more appropriate time to talk about that as well.
Absolutely.
The tax issues have been screwed up for the last few years because most people don't want to give more than $20,000 to the church in a year. But nevertheless, that's a challenge. So
yeah,
we should rise to meet those challenges, and we should also rise to meet the challenge of creating a congregational endowment using the resources that come in, because if you have the endowment, then you have the ability to care for your air conditioning system.
Absolutely. And if you're going to talk about an endowment, I encourage churches to have endowments, but I encourage them to be clear on what the endowment is for. The endowment is for ministry. The endowment is not to keep the doors open. The endowment is for ministry. And you need to re-look at it every year. If you want to get me to give to the endowment, tell me what the endowment is for. There needs to be advanced directives there. Not because I want to control where it is, but because I want to know that it's going to change lives and how it's going to change lives. And I'll also say the best way, in my congregation in Raleigh, one of the ways that we got folks to think about their RMDs, you know RMDs, right? to think about their RMDs is we had somebody come up and tell why they gave their RMD to the church every year. Instead of me telling you to give your RMD to the church every year, we had somebody give up and say why they were excited to do it. And we started to get RMDs because his generosity spurred on other people's generosity.
Yeah, I wanted to mention something about endowments. A very wise person told us, and we have a very small endowment at St. Michael, but we were told, I don't care if it's just $100, give away $5 and highlight the gift that you're doing. And so our endowment's small, it's $150,000 to $170,000. And so last year was the first year in some time that we went and solicited, people who wanted us to give, solicited proposals for gifts. And then we voted on those, and we gave 3 small amounts of about $5,000 each to these 3 organizations, and then highlighted them on the Sundays after we did it. And can I tell a quick story about RMDs? I had a client once, and she was in the Methodist church in Anderson, and she said, I said something about RMDs, and she said, oh, I know all about that. She said, we have a couple in our church that on the first Sunday of the year, they always give their RMD, their required minimum distribution, to the church. And then for the next 51 Sundays, they put an empty envelope in the offering plate.
Check, check.
Or actually, we have one coming here. Emily's got one. Thanks, Emily.
Here to serve.
Oh, this is the Britney Spears kind that goes all the way around my head.
Or you can swap out your thing.
No, that's okay. I'll get it. Okay. Thank you. So, Peggy asked a question about when to do this and how to talk about it. Oh, that's much louder. And I really think however works for your congregation is the best way, but you're not going to over-communicate. If you tell stories of impact, you're not going to over-communicate. Now, certainly if you're always asking for money, which you shouldn't do, by the way, tell stories of impact and people align with the story of impact more than anything. But you can't over-communicate. And so I use every available tool. Mailings, physical mailings. By the way, mail still works. Seriously, it does. And people are like, well, Gen Z doesn't look at mail. My sons are so excited when they get mail. They still look at mail. Email, for sure. And then printed bulletins. The number one thing that visitors in your church take home with them are the bulletins. That's the number one thing they take home with them, which is why if you're putting in the numbers of the offering from last week, what you got and what you needed, and usually when people do that, by the way, all they've done is taken their budget and they chopped it up into 12. And that's not realistic. You don't even do your house budget like that. You want to know how I know? Because you just went on vacation this summer, which means you spent a little bit more in June or July than you did last February. It's not all equal. And even if you adjust it, it doesn't end up being equal because you are part of a nonprofit. One of the secrets that I'll tell you about nonprofits, having been a fundraiser in the nonprofit world and then having been a branch manager of a nonprofit, It's a parish pastor. One of the deep truths is that 20% of your budget comes in December every year, which means that you're in the red for the majority of the year. Because 20%, the way that taxes in the United States work, 20% of your budget will come in December. So why when churches call me in June and they're like, we're behind budget. And I was like, you're running about average. Yeah, so is everybody. We're all behind budget right now. At least on paper, doesn't mean you're going to end up that way. But if you have that in the bulletin, people go home, they were a visitor, they loved the worship, they thought the music was great, the pastor is good, oh, but they're 20,000 behind on budget, we can't go there, that's a sinking ship. Take it out. You can put it in the narthex someplace else, right? If people want to see it, put it on a bulletin board if you still have those in your church, right? Put them there. And instead, put a quote, an area of impact. Put a quote from somebody who saw something at last week's worship who thought it was really cool. Or a quote from somebody whose life was changed because of the ministry at St. Martin's. You know, my council meeting in my last parish, instead of just starting with regular business, old business, new business, anything like that, I started by saying, somebody tell me something cool they saw this last month at the church. And they would start talking about stories of things that they saw that was really cool. You know, that acolyte, she was brand new, but she did a really good job last Sunday. I was like, yeah, Brittany did a really good job. Hey, I have Brittany's parents' cell number right here. Can you text them and tell them that she did a really good job? Or John did a really good job on that organ piece 2 weeks ago. I was like, he worked hard on that. That's true. Hey, can you send John an email right now and just say thanks for that? When you start telling stories of impact, how other people impacted you, and you start looking for them. Now folks would come out, or the council members would come out of church, and they would say, hey, by the way, I saw something really cool today, and it was this, and nobody else can steal this story when it comes to the council meeting next week. I was like, all right, that one's yours. You can have that one, right? But they started looking for it. And you know what happened when you started looking for cool things happening? You saw all the cool things happening. We can starve in a pantry, beloved, if we just look at the floor. So many of our churches are just looking at the floor. Tell stories of impact. Get them to look up. Use your council. Council can look up. Start your annual meeting. If you don't tell a generosity story, hey, what was something cool that you saw happen this year at church? Talk to each other. Go. Start sharing. Telling stories, hearing stories, and then using them to show the impact that you do. Because you are changing lives by God. One final thing here, and then we'll have some time for questions and wrap-ups. And this is it's a picture my wife took of my sons one early morning. And this is by my favorite Irish poet, Padraig Tuma. And I said to him, are there answers to all of this? And he said, the answer is in a story, and the story is being told. And I said, but there is so much pain. And she answered plainly, pain will happen. Then I said, will I ever find meaning? And they said, you will find meaning where you give meaning. The answer is in the story, and the story isn't finished. The story of your ministry, your church, with all the beauty and the pain that's in there, it's not finished. You can tell it. Thank you for inviting me today. Appreciate it. I'll take questions still, but thank you very much.